and we will share this recording out later this week. We have time at the end of our call to answer any questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop those in the group chat, or you can directly message me. With that, I will go ahead and have Matthew get started.
Good morning. So it's great to see all of you here today. And yeah, I'm looking forward to talking to you about page indexing. So let's get started by talking about what indexing is and why it matters for SEO, and in particular, why it matters for the technical side of SEO. So broadly speaking, SEO breaks down into three main steps of the process: how Google is processing things, how Google is working on things. Really, this applies to any search engine that we might be looking at or trying to understand how it works. The first thing Google has to do is they have to go out and find everything that exists out on the web. They have to crawl through the web. Crawling breaks down into a lot of substeps, and two of the most important substeps are going to be going out on the web and discovering all the different pages that exist, discovering all the different URLs that are out there, URLs to web pages, URLs to images, to videos, to documents, anything that's out there. Google wants to know about it. That's the discovery part of the crawling process. Once Google has discovered something, then they need to go back to that URL. They then need to fetch and retrieve information from that page. After Google has crawled everything, we move into the second step of the process, which is indexing. During the indexing process, Google has a mess of information that they've collected from the crawling process. It's disorganized, it's scattered across lots of different websites. So during the indexing process, Google needs to organize this. They need to figure out what's going on with all the information they found during the crawl. They have to evaluate the pages. They have to process through all this information. They have to decide how good some of these pages are and which ones are better, which ones are more related to certain topics than others. After Google goes through and decides all those things during the indexing process, then Google has an index of pages that's really well organized, and they can draw on that index to decide how they're going to present things in search results. That's the ranking part of the process. So there's a lot of details, and any one of those steps we could spend all day talking about any one of those steps for sure. But at a high level, Google breaks down into those three main steps: crawling, indexing, and ranking content. And today we're going to focus on this middle step of indexing. And I think indexing is probably the most important step to pay attention to when it comes to SEO and how we try to understand how to improve our SEO performance. Because indexing can really be thought of as a transitionary period. During the crawling stages, you get to make a lot of the decisions about what's happening with your website's information. How are things going to be presented? How are things going to be structured? What content are you going to emphasize? How are you going to emphasize that content? During the last stage, the ranking stage, Google gets to make a lot of those decisions. Google gets to decide how are things going to be presented in search results. Google gets to decide what information is actually shown to people who are conducting a search result and in what order are different websites shown in search results, right? So during the crawling stage, you get to make a lot of decisions. And during the ranking stage, Google gets to make a lot of the decisions. And in the indexing stage, we're in this transition period where we're transitioning from you deciding to Google deciding. And so we want to make sure that as our content is transitioning through this process, Google is making the right decisions about our website's content, that they're going to make the correct decisions. That way our website ranks correctly in search results. So that gets us to the question of, well, what is indexing and what is Google specifically doing here? How are they making those decisions about your website's content? So Google, for their part, defines indexing as a page that's been visited by a Googlebot, by their crawler, so it's actually been seen. They then have gone through and analyzed that page for both content and meaning they're really trying to extract what is this page about. This is where natural language processing comes into play, where Google is really trying to understand the page as close as they possibly can to how an actual human is understanding the page. And then once they've done that, once they've extracted meaning and extracted what this page is about, then they store this page in their index. And once it's in the index, then it's eligible to show in search results. Now, there's a really important phrase they put in at the end here that they're only eligible to show in search results, meaning they're only going to end up in Google's index if those pages follow Google Search Essentials. So we then need to ask, well, what are these Google Search Essentials? And Google Search Essentials are basically everything you've ever heard of that Google is talking about, how they evaluate pages. And I think a lot of people think of these search essentials as ranking criteria, and indirectly they are. Indirectly, they influence where your website ranks. But really, what these search essentials come down to is their indexing criteria. This is how Google is making decisions about what to do with your website's content. And we want to make sure that we understand Google Search Essentials so that way we know how Google is going to make decisions. And we can hopefully influence Google to make sure that they make better decisions about our website's content. So these search essentials include things like meeting basic technical requirements, making sure that your website doesn't have a lot of spam, making sure your website follows all of Google's best practices. Those best practices include things like helpful content, which has obviously been something that we've been talking a lot about over the last couple of years with Google. Also talking about relevancy and how your website is structured. So much of how Google understands your page, so much of how Google makes decisions is about how your page is structured. That's both what HTML tags you're using, that's what schema you're using, that's also just how your page is designed. Search essentials also include whether or not internal links are supporting crawlability. Is Google actually able to understand your meaning of pages and how pages are related to each other via those internal links? Also, within Search Essentials, we've got things about enhanced search results. That's largely schema, but there's a few other things in there as well. And then also within Search Essentials, this is about how Google is crawling and indexing your site. What are you doing to communicate with Google? So if you've heard about no index tags or disallow tags, that plays into this as well. So it's all these kinds of things Google is using to make decisions about what's going to end up in the index, what's going to be eligible to rank. All of these are how Google is making decisions about your website's content. So we need to understand these things. And more importantly, we need to understand what Google is doing with each of these things and how they're making decisions with our website's content. And that brings us to the Google Search Console page indexing report. So this report, I think a lot of people look at this as a way to find errors on their website, find problems that Google is surfacing on their website. And it definitely can be used for that. It is a great way to find problems on your website. But it's a lot more than that. What you can really think of the Search Console page indexing report as is it's Google's way of communicating with you. It's Google's way of telling you, here's what we've decided to do with your website's content. Now, some of those things that Google has decided are going to be incorrect. They are going to be problems. They are going to be errors and things that you need to fix. But a lot of the things that Google has found and a lot of the things that you're going to see in the page indexing report are decisions Google is making that you're largely going to agree with, that you're going to say, yeah, I'm actually happy that Google decided to do this thing with my website. And so you want to review the page indexing report, not just with the idea in mind of how do I find problems, how do I find errors, but more so, how do you understand Google's decision process? So with that in mind, let's hop over to the page indexing report and take a look at this and try to understand what's going on in here. And I just want to show you around this report so that you can go in and start using it on your website. Or if you are already using it, maybe understand a few new things about how to use this report. So this is part of Google Search Console. Most people already have Google Search Console set up. If you are not familiar with Google Search Console or not sure if you have Google Search Console set up, this is at google.com/webmasters. So it's previously it was called Google Webmaster Tools. Google Search Console is a free tool that you can use. You just have to verify your website and then you can set it up. Lots of details about what's going on with your website. So on the page indexing report in here, at the very top, we have two numbers that get a lot of attention. We'll pay a lot of attention to these numbers. We've got not indexed and we've got indexed. Now, the first thing I want to say is that there's no magic number that these should be, right? There's no magic number you need to aim for. You don't need to try and make these numbers higher. You don't need to try and make these numbers lower. There's also nothing magic about the ratio between these two numbers. I've seen some people say that, oh, you need to make sure that you don't have so many indexed pages relative to your not indexed pages or vice versa. That's not true. You can have, as many not indexed pages as are appropriate for your website. You can have as many index pages as are appropriate for your website. It's not so much about the high level count. It's going to be more about the details of what's behind these numbers that we're actually going to get into here in a few minutes. But the high level numbers are important to look at, get a general sense of what's going on with your website. If you look at this and you see a few hundred pages listed here, these are all the pages Google knows about, all the different URLs Google knows about on your website. And if you actually have thousands of pages on your website and you only see a few hundred listed here, that indicates there's some kind of problem. Google's missing out on lots of pages on your website. On the other hand, if you look at this and think, well, I only have a few hundred pages on my website, but you see millions of pages listed here, then you also have a problem, and Google's finding lots of other things on your website that they shouldn't be. So looking at the numbers isn't something that you need to optimize for, isn't something you need to really focus on specifically what the numbers are. It's more so, how do these numbers reflect your website? Are they pretty close to reflecting what your website's actually presenting, or are these numbers pretty far off from what your website actually contains? The other thing at the top of the screen, we have our trend lines. So we can toggle off either indexed or not indexed to see just the trend line of that category. And this here too is not something that we need to pay attention to. There's nothing great about having either of these trend up or trend down. It's more about what's right for your website and what's fitting based on what you've been working on your website. So if you've been working on cleaning up maybe some old content on your website, some outdated content, unhelpful content, setting things to no index, removing pages, that kind of stuff, you'll probably see not indexed pages increasing steadily over time as you're working on those changes. That's great. That's the trend line that you expect to see. If, on the other hand, you see this increasing, but you haven't been making changes, then there's probably something you need to dig into and see what's going on. And the same would be true with index pages. Is it trending up? Is it trending down? And does that fit with the kinds of projects you've been working on your website? So long as these trend lines align with the kinds of things you've been working on your website, no big deal. But if they don't align, then you have some indication that there's probably some kind of problem that you need to look at and see what's going on. So the details are down here in this table, why pages aren't indexed. So this is where Google is going to tell you what they've decided on your website. So they've gone through and they've understood that there's all these different URLs on your website. Here's what they've decided to do about the not indexed pages. So on here, you'll see a whole bunch of reasons listed for why pages are not indexed on your website. Some of these are going to be things that are great. You want these pages to not be indexed. Others of these are going to be problems that you need to fix on your website. And I'll talk more about what these reasons are specifically and which ones are problems and not in just a few minutes. But just to show you around here in the page indexing report, on any one of these reasons, you can click into it and you can see a list of URLs with this issue. So I'll click on page with redirect as an example. So on page with redirect, we can click into this and then we can see the details of this. We can see details of how this is trending. Here again, look for alignment. Does this trend up? If it's trending up and you've been changing URLs recently and adding redirects, that's great. If you haven't been changing anything and it's trending up, well, then why is Google finding a lot of redirects you weren't expecting on your website? And then down here, we can see a list of all the URLs that Google has found that do redirect or whatever other reason it is. So we can find all these URLs down here. Now, the thing to keep in mind with these URLs is that Google caps this at 1,000 URLs on every one of these reports. If you only have 103 pages in this particular category, no big deal. You'll see all the URLs listed that are not indexed for this reason. But if you have more than 1,000 pages that are not indexed for this reason, then you'll be missing out on things. And unfortunately, there's just not a way to get those URLs. That's just not something Google provides. That sample of 1,000 isn't necessarily a fair sample. It's not going to show you a representative of every type of error that fits into this particular category. More often than not, it's just the latest 1,000 URLs that Google found that were not indexed for this reason. But it is the only list we have. So you can go through that list and hopefully start figuring out some of the reasons that Google has made this decision about these particular URLs. Now, on any one of these URLs, the other thing you can do is you can dig into this URL specifically. So if you hover over a URL and you hit the magnifying glass, that'll bring up a URL inspection report. And so this URL inspection report gives you details specifically about this URL. And so on here, you can get some of the same information we just saw on the other page. You can get that page is not indexed, page has a redirect, but also on here, you can see the last time this was crawled. You can also sometimes see where Google found this URL. So where did they actually see this page when they were out crawling the web? How did they discover this page? It's not always going to be listed here, but sometimes it is. And sometimes that can be helpful if you are digging into a problem to see what's going on and where Google may have come across this particular issue. And that way you can start fixing the problem in a different way if you know where Google found that problem in the first place. One thing I do want to mention on here, since we're looking at a page with redirect, something that I think gets pretty confusing with how Google shows redirects in this report is that it says page with redirect, but then down here it says that indexing is allowed, even though we're saying that the page is not indexed. So why is there a discrepancy between those two? So what's happening here is anytime you inspect a redirected URL, this indexing allowed is actually about the redirect destination. So this URL, it redirects somewhere else, right? It points to a different URL. And so Google is following that redirect, and then they're telling us that the redirect destination, wherever that redirect points to, that's allowed. And we see the same thing happening down here with the canonical tag. The canonical tag is going to represent the final destination of that redirect. So this robots-no index URL redirects to this no index versus no follow versus disallow URL. And Google is showing us that they followed that redirect. I just wanted to point that out because that is something I know trips people up and just seems really confusing the way Google presents it. And it is frankly pretty confusing how Google presents that. The other thing you can do on the URL inspection report is you can test the live URL on here. So if you have recently changed this, let's say this represents some problem that we're digging into, you can test the live URL and make sure that Google is seeing the corrected changes, which is really helpful to do as you're trying to debug and fix things. You can make sure that it's going to work for Google a little more quickly. Going back over here to this main report under the page indexing, one other thing I wanted to point out was that we have a validate fix button. Now, you do not have to ever use the validate fix button. The validate fix button is a way to tell Google that, hey, we know that this down here represented some kind of problem. If it does represent a problem. And if you fix that problem, you can tell Google, hey, we fixed this by clicking validate fix. You don't have to hit the validate fix button, though. Google will go back. They will recrawl these pages. And we can see that even here. These have been recrawled pretty recently, even though some of these redirects have existed for years. Google is always going back, recrawling old pages. So if you fix something, let's say these do represent a problem, and you fix it, Google's going to go back. They're going to recrawl that page on their own. The only reason you'd need to use validate fix is to maybe encourage Google to go back a little bit sooner to click on something. The other thing about validate fix is sometimes you run the validation, you tell Google, hey, we fixed this issue, and Google goes through, they recrawl things on here, and then the validation fails. And they'll come back with an error to you telling you, hey, no, we still see this problem as it exists today. And a lot of people get concerned about that. And the way Google presents that response to the validation does look pretty scary. It looks like something maybe is wrong, like there is a problem on there, but there really isn't. You can validate fix, you can have validations fail multiple times over and over again. It's not going to impact your site performance, it's not going to affect how Google evaluates your site quality, nothing like that. So you can use the validate fix as much as you need to if you want to encourage Google to go back and recrawl something, and if these actually represent a problem. Something like page with redirect, all of these redirect as they're supposed to. So there's no problem here, and there's absolutely no need to fix anything, let alone any need to validate fix. The other thing I do want to mention on the page indexing report is one other tool that you can use here, which is pretty helpful. All of this we've been looking at so far is site-wide. This is giving us information about the entire website and everything Google has seen on this website and all the decisions Google has made on this website. But we can filter this down, and we can filter this to only show pages that were submitted in the website's XML sitemap. So the website's XML sitemap, it's going to include the pages that we really want to tell Google about, that we really want Google to index, that we really want Google to rank. And so if we filter this down to all submitted pages, meaning all pages listed in our XML sitemap that we really want Google to rank, that we really want Google to index, that will change all of these reports to only show us that narrow list of URLs. And we can see how many of those are indexed, how many of those are not indexed, and we can see why some of those pages may not be indexed. So it's a helpful way to segment this down to certain types of pages on your website. You can also segment this down to specific sitemaps. So if you have multiple sitemaps on your website, let's say you have a sitemap for each section of content on your website or each category on your blog post, something like that, you can filter that down and get really granular at understanding how Google is indexing different parts of your website. All right, now that we've looked at the page indexing report, I want to talk more about the reasons things are not indexed and what specifically Google is doing on it. So when we talk about the reasons things are not indexed, the first thing I want to point out is there's a lot of different reasons that things cannot be indexed. And we can group those different reasons into a few different larger buckets, larger categories. And within each of those categories, some are not a problem. They're just notifications from Google that, hey, we saw this page. We don't think it's something you wanted in the index. We're not going to put in the index. Other things are actually a problem that Google encountered that we need to address. And so within each of these categories, we have things we need to pay attention to, we need to fix. We have things that maybe we don't need to pay attention to. We don't really need to worry about too much. So one of the categories that we have within the reasons pages are not indexed has to do with redirects. So we have page with redirect. That's one we were just looking at in the page indexing report. And usually these are valid. When you go through and you look at the URLs that are listed, that redirect, most oftentimes they redirect because you wanted them to redirect. Only very rarely do I look at somebody's Search Console report and see that a page redirects when it wasn't supposed to. Something happened accidentally. So it's worth going through and double checking those URLs, particularly if it's been increasing over time. You have a bunch of new URLs that are coming in that redirect. Make sure there's no mistakes. But for the most part, that's going to be valid. You've implemented that redirect. You wanted Google to take that out of the index and rank a different page. That's why you changed the URL. And that's why you implemented the redirect. But there are also pages that are not indexed because they have a redirect error. So a redirect error means that you've tried to implement a redirect, you've tried to maybe point one URL to a different URL, but then there's a problem with that redirect. And usually these redirect errors are something like a redirect chain or a redirect loop. So a redirect chain is where you're redirecting from page A to page B to page C to page D. So that redirect from page A to page D, it has to go through multiple hops, and that can slow things down. It can be a little harder for Google to process things. Also just be a little harder for people to use your website as well with that type of redirect error. So you need to fix that chain. A redirect loop is a chain that goes back on itself. So you've got A to B to C to D, and then it goes back to A. You want to break that loop so that way you don't get stuck in this infinite cycle that's going to result in an error. So redirect errors are something that's usually a problem, something you need to go through and take care of on your website and fix. Another reason that pages are not indexed has to do with robot control settings. These are almost always valid. There's usually no problem here that you need to fix. So there's two of these that you'll see in the Search Console page indexing report. The first is excluded by the no index tag, and the second is blocked by robots.txt. Excluded by the no index tag means that you have added a meta robots no index to your website's pages. And if you've added the meta robots no index to your website's pages, then you're telling Google intentionally you want to take this page out of the index. You do not want them including. So this is Google's way of telling you they saw that meta robots no index, and they are going to exclude that page from search results. Now, within here, that excluded by no index tag sometimes can be a problem. If you have, let's say, a staging environment that you have a no index on, and you launch that staging environment to production, sometimes that meta robots tag accidentally gets included in that launch and it ends up on the production environment. And if it does, then you're telling Google to no index the entirety of your production environment. That's definitely a problem and definitely something you want to take care of. So you want to look through these URLs, make sure that nothing accidentally ends up in the excluded by no index bucket for sure. But for the most part, these are pages that you've intentionally set. And if they are pages you've intentionally set to no index, not something you need to worry about. The other category we have is blocked by robots.txt. This one can sometimes be a little confusing because Google's guidelines say that the robots.txt file, when you add a statement on the robots.txt file to disallow a page, all you're doing is telling Google not to crawl that page. But Google's own guidelines say that pages that are blocked from crawling on the robots.txt file can still be indexed in search results. What Google is telling you here with the blocked by robots.txt is that not only have they decided not to crawl this page and respect your robots.txt file, but they've also decided to take an extra step and not index this page. That doesn't always happen. And we'll talk more about the robots.txt file and the other side of it with pages ending up in the index in a few minutes. But when you see that here with the blocked by robots.txt, make sure that that's what you intended. Did you only intend to block crawling, but you wanted it to still be indexed? If so, that could be a problem. Or are you okay with a page that you blocked from crawling also being blocked from indexing? If so, nothing you need to do about with that one. Another reason why pages aren't indexed are different kinds of errors. And even though these are called errors, there are some reasons why things return an error that we still want Google to find that error, that we still want Google to see that it contains an error, and we're okay with it not being indexed for that reason. And that main reason why we see things that end up not indexed that we're okay with, that we don't want Google indexing, is the not found error. So a not found error, a lot of people get worried about. They think, oh, I have a lot of not found errors. That must be a problem, and they need to add a lot of redirects for this. No, you don't need to do that. And the not found error is actually a perfectly legitimate signal that you can send to Google to tell them that you've removed pages from your website. These pages are not valid. These pages should not be included in search results. The not found error is a great way to fix things like thin content or unhelpful content. You want to delete those pages that are unhelpful, that include thin content from your website. And by deleting those pages and sending a 404, you're actually communicating to Google that you've taken really strong measures to clean up the quality of your website. So not found errors are a very important way to fix certain problems. So by seeing them here, that's actually a good sign in a lot of cases. So in most cases, you don't want to go through and fix the not found errors that you see listed here. But there are some types of errors that are problems that you usually need to go through and do something about and fix those on your website. One of those that you typically need to go through and fix is a soft 404. So a soft 404 error means that the page itself, the text of the page itself, says that this page is broken. This page is not found. This page has some kind of problem with it. But the status code, which is a numerical number that's sent to bots telling them something about the page, it sends a signal of status 200, which says everything's okay here. There's no problems. So we've got a discrepancy between what the status code is telling bots and what the page text is telling users and bots. And Google's going to flag that. And they're going to flag that as a soft 404. Usually when you see a soft 404, you want to fix that. And you want to make sure that both the status code and the page text are communicating the same thing on here. Another reason that you'll see pages not be indexed is another 4XX issue. Sometimes this indicates a problem. Sometimes these are valid and not anything you need to worry about. Another 4XX issue means that the status code being returned to the bots is some type of 4XX status code. That could be a 403, that could be a 401, a 400, something like that. And that status code indicates that something went wrong with the page. In some cases, these are just miscategorized 404s, nothing you need to do about them. In other cases, it's something wonky about how your page is structured and you need to go and fix it. So it's always something you need to investigate, always something you need to look at, and sometimes can be something you need to fix. We then have server errors. Server error means that your server actually failed and did not return anything for Google to find when they were crawling that particular page. And so if your server fails, that's usually a problem that you need to go through and fix. It could just be the server was down for maintenance and maybe it's already back up. And this problem will kind of fix itself as Google goes back and recrawls things. Maybe that's an area where you want to run a validate fix to hopefully encourage recrawls a little bit more quickly. Other times the server is down because of an actual problem, though, that you need to fix. Another category that we have for reasons pages are not indexed is duplication. So when it comes to duplication, one category is usually not a problem, and that's alternate page with proper canonical tag. So alternate page with proper canonical tag means that Google was crawling through your website and they found that you have a canonical tag present. Canonical tag is something you add that controls duplication. So if you know on your website that you have multiple URLs that return very similar content or pages that have a very similar intent, you can use a canonical tag to tell Google which page you prefer they use, even though both pages are very similar. And when you see pages listed in alt page with proper canonical tag, that means Google is respecting your canonical tag. That means Google is actually following what you have told them to do. And so in those cases, you're good. You don't need to do anything here. You don't need to worry about this problem. You don't need to fix this problem. Sometimes here again, you can see ones that Google mistakenly puts in this categories, might have something to clean up, but for the most part, that's not a problem. Where you see bigger problems with duplication, though, is in two other categories. Duplicate, Google chose different canonical than user, and duplicate without user selected canonical. So duplicate, Google chose different canonical means that as Google was going through your website, they saw your canonical tag, but they didn't agree with your canonical tag. They think you need to do something different with your canonical tag. So in this case, Google is making a decision that contradicts the decision that you made. and you want to understand why. Why did Google make a different decision than you did? And is that okay? How Google ended up deciding things? Is that going to work out okay for you if those other pages show up in search results, or is that going to present a problem? If it presents a problem, then you need to proactively work on this and try and get Google to make a different decision about how to handle this duplication. In the other case, we've got duplicate without user selected canonical. This means one of two things. It either means Google did not find a canonical tag because you did not have a canonical tag defined, in which case you're not communicating what you prefer to Google. So Google is finding duplication, but they don't know what you wanted to do. So they're going to put those pages into a not index status until you give them some direction with that canonical tag. The other thing, though, that can happen with dupe without user selected canonical is that you do have a canonical stated, but Google didn't see it during the crawl. And in that case, you don't really have a duplication problem as much as you have some kind of problem with Google not seeing your code correctly. It could be a rendering issue, there could be a speed issue where things didn't load quickly enough for Google to see that tag. And in that case, you need to go through and figure out, okay, why did that canonical tag not show up? And what do I need to do to resolve this problem on here? So duplicate without user selected canonical almost always is a problem that you need to go through and fix. Another category we have for reasons pages are not indexed is authorization. There's two of these, and almost always they're valid and not something you need to worry about. We've got blocked due to access forbidden, that returns a 403, and blocked due to unauthorized request 401. There are differences between 401 and 403, but for our purposes here today, it's simple enough to say that both of these usually are some type of login error. So if you cannot log into something, the server is going to respond back with a 403 or a 401 saying that you are unable to log in. You are not granted access to this particular site, which if you are trying to restrict access to something, maybe you have a login area on your website, you don't want Google to see that, these are the appropriate response codes to see here. This is also the appropriate thing to see for a staging environment. You want to lock that staging environment down by a password restriction. And so if it's locked down with a password restriction, Google's not going to be able to enter in a username or password to access it. So they're going to get a 403 or a 401. Here again, you can have some pages that accidentally end up here. Maybe you blocked access unintentionally to certain pages of your website or something like that. But for the most part, these are not a problem. That then brings us to the last two reasons pages are not indexed. And these are the two most confusing: discovered not indexed and crawled not indexed. So discovered not indexed, to understand that one, think back to that very first slide I showed of the way search engines work. We've got crawling, indexing, ranking. And within that crawling process, the very first step of crawling is Google has to go out and they have to find all those different URLs that exist on the web. They have to discover all that different content. So pages listed here in discovered not indexed mean that they're stuck at that very first step of the crawling process. So it's probably better to think of discovered not indexed as discovered, not crawled, and not indexed, right? So we're really saying that Google hasn't done anything else with this URL on here. And so the question is why? Why hasn't Google done anything else on here? And usually it's because Google doesn't think this page is very important. They think this page just doesn't matter. So they're not prioritizing going back to it. They're not prioritizing fetching content from that page or moving it into the index. They just don't see why they should. So you need to check if there is some kind of crawlability issue. Sometimes there's technical reasons that prevent Google from being able to successfully crawl the page, and that's why it's getting stuck here. But in a lot of cases, it comes down to you're not communicating the priority. So how can you add more internal links to this page? Sometimes external links can do this as well, but especially internal links can signal to Google that you really think this page matters. If you only have one internal link on a site with millions of pages pointing to some other page, that's not nearly enough. Google's going to think it's super low priority. But if they see dozens of internal links pointing to another page or hundreds of internal links pointing to another page, then they're going to start to understand that maybe this other page that's getting that many internal links might matter. It might be important. Maybe we need to go look at what's going on with this page. Then we have crawl not indexed. So with crawl not indexed, this means that we've moved through the crawling stage, but now we're stuck at the indexing stage. So Google's gone through, they've fetched content from the page, they know what this page is about, but they're still trying to process it and figure out what's going on with it. So sometimes this is a temporary state. You see pages kind of show up here for a few days or maybe a week or so while Google's kind of going through and processing things. And you just kind of see the page move through Google's process. And if that's the case, no big deal. But it's when things get stuck here. They're in this category for weeks on end, or in some cases, months or even years on end, that you really know you have a problem. In a lot of cases, this is some kind of low quality content. So you need to look at the content on that page and figure out, okay, is this a low quality page? Is this unhelpful? Is it not meeting some of those search essentials in some other way? Sometimes this happens too, not so much with problems with the content, but Google's inability to see the content. So if your content is loaded by JavaScript code, you have a very dynamic website, well, maybe Google can't render that content, right? They can't execute that JavaScript. So they're not seeing any content on here, and things are going to end up in this category instead. Now, along with all the reasons pages are not indexed, the other thing you'll sometimes see on the page indexing report is a box that looks like this that says improve page appearance. So when it comes to page appearance, what Google is telling you is that these pages are indexed, but they think there's something wrong with the page where it's not going to show up correctly in search results. So the idea of Google's trying to communicate something to you with this report, what they're communicating here is, hey, we've moved it through the indexing process, but you still need to look at it. There's still something potentially wrong with this page. And there's two categories that end up in here for improved page appearance. One is indexed, though blocked by robots.txt, and the other is page indexed without content. So indexed, blocked by robots.txt is the other side of that robots.txt block that we were talking about a few minutes ago. So that blocked by robots.txt block can either end up with an indexed or not indexed status. So when you block something from crawling by robots.txt, Google still knows about that URL. All you've done with the robots.txt is tell Google you can't crawl it. But Google is free to make their own decisions about whether or not that page should still show up in search results or not. So if you see it in this category, indexed though blocked by robots.txt, that means that Google is still going to show that in search results, even though they can't crawl that page. They're not going to show much in search results, though. And that's the problem on here, is that Google doesn't know the title of the page. They don't know any content from the page. They don't really know what the page is about. They're just inferring meaning of that page based on the links and other signals they saw referencing that page. So you want to look at this and decide, well, do I want that page showing up in search results or not? Am I okay with this state? If you aren't okay with that state, you probably need to allow crawling and then handle indexing in a different way. The other category we have here, page indexed without content, typically indicates a problem. This typically indicates that Google wasn't able to render the page correctly. They didn't see any content here. Sometimes this can be some type of cloaking issue, spam issues, something like that, where you need to dig in and look at what's going on with these URLs. So there's obviously a lot going on with the page indexing report. There's a lot of different reasons that I've gone through here today. Every single one of these is something that has a lot of nuance, has a lot of details within it. So I'm happy to take any questions that you have about any of those reasons here this morning. If you do want more details, though, I do have a book that came out last year called Tech SEO Guide, and it walks through a lot of these different reasons and a lot of the different things going on with how Google is making decisions about your website's content and the kinds of things you can do to help Google hopefully make better decisions about your website's content. So you can find that book on Amazon. It's available in Kindle or paperback. You can also learn more about it at techseoguide.com. So with that, I think we still have a few minutes left here today. So I'm happy to take any questions that you have. Andrea, do we have any questions that have come in?
We don't have any that have come into chat. So if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to drop those in. So with that in mind, though, I will ask a few common questions we get, which is, how often should you check Google Search Console, especially the page indexing report, and even beyond that, how much should you be checking in on the performance report as a diagnosis tool?
So the page indexing report, how often you check that depends on how active your website is. You should certainly be checking the page indexing report very often after you release changes on your website. So if you've just released something, especially if it's a bigger release of changes, you want to keep an eye on that page indexing report over the next several weeks to see how Google is responding to all the new stuff you've added to your website. More on a regular basis, at least once a month. If you have a fairly active website, it's a good idea to go through and check that page indexing report. Sometimes, even though you haven't made changes to your website, Google is finding other things about your website, and they're going to start reporting on those things in here. Sometimes things happen on your website that you aren't ready for, or you aren't prepared for, that you didn't know were going to change. Maybe a system automatically upgrades, or maybe you have a lot of user generated content. So you want to keep an eye on that. And monthly is usually a pretty good time frame for most websites. Obviously, if your website's a lot more active, you have a lot more going on, maybe even weekly. If it's not very active, maybe quarterly is okay to check the page indexing report. On the performance side, I think that one's important to check, several times a week to see how your traffic is trending with Google, especially if a lot of your website's traffic depends pretty heavily on organic traffic. If you're highly dependent on that, you want to see how that's trending. And there are problems with Google's performance report. They don't show you everything. There are some, missing data points, and there's things that don't always align with other analytics tools. But it's still the only insight we have into what Google is telling us about what's going on with our website's performance. So by focusing on that performance report, by keeping a close eye on it, we can see how those things are trending on our website.
Another big one we get questions about is how you can use the page indexing report to understand crawl budget or potential issues with crawl budget. What are some of the places that we look at when we're trying to identify crawl?
The page indexing report itself is one step beyond the crawling process, right? So Google's already crawled things. Now they're trying to index things. But within that page indexing report, we can still get some ideas of what Google has found or not found on our website within that process of crawling our website and how they're starting to index things. One of the biggest things you can find is just the volume of pages. Like I was saying, if you look at that number of pages and it says you have 100 pages on your website, but you only have 50 pages on your website, well, then why has Google suddenly found these other 50 URLs? That's excess stuff that they're crawling. That's excess stuff that they're trying to process and pay attention to that we really don't need them to process or pay attention to on our website. So we can start to find those URLs within the page indexing report and start trying to understand what kinds of problems that represents. Google also has in Search Console a whole separate report about crawling and how they handle crawling on your website. And that can be really insightful to understand the crawling side of things as well. And that's another one that could be really important to pay attention to understand that first step of the process of how Google is crawling through your site.
We have a question that came in from Alex. I'm seeing a lot of pages in our index report that are essentially the same page with different query strings. Does Google see those as unique pages?
Depends on what category you're seeing them in. So if you're seeing pages with query strings in duplicate, Google or alternate page with proper canonical tag, then that means that Google is correctly understanding that those query strings are just an alternate version of that page, and they're respecting your website's canonical tag. So in that case, that's okay. Google's doing the right thing there. If you see URLs with query strings in another category, let's say you see them in duplicate, Google chose different canonical than user, that can mean that those query strings are going to start leaking out onto search results. And that could really start presenting a problem where you have a lot of your own website's pages competing against each other. And in that case, that is a problem, and you need to find a way to lock that down. If the canonical tag isn't doing enough to restrict access to those query strings, sometimes you need to no index URLs that contain a particular query string. In other cases, you need to redirect URLs that contain a query string and just clear that query string out of the URL. Both a no index and a redirect are going to be stronger signals than a canonical to control that. The other category where you can sometimes see URLs show up with a query string is crawl not indexed. And so if they end up in crawl not indexed, that's probably a sign that Google thinks those are problematic pages, unhelpful pages. And in that case, the canonical may be enough, but in those cases with those pages showing up in crawl not indexed, you almost always need to implement a stronger signal, like no indexing pages with that query string, redirecting URLs with that query string, or even in some cases, just breaking those URLs with the query string and actually having URLs that contain that query string, then return a 404 error on your website instead. So depending on which category you see them in the Search Console report, changes the level of severity of those URLs.
Well, with that, again, we want to just thank everybody for joining us today. If you would like to connect with us, here's our information. And we just hope you have a wonderful day. So thank you so much. And we'll see you next time at another webinar, we hope. Take care, everyone. Thanks.